We're going to continue on with Chapter 1, What is Science? We're going to start with talking about the nature of science. Science, as we know it, is not new to us. Science has been part of our civilization for as far back as we have at least recorded history, but we haven't really known what we call modern science very long. In fact, modern science is really only about 300 years old. So the change in what we have, kind of an ancient perspective of science to modern science, began with Galileo and Newton. Before Galileo and Newton, what we had were these ancient natural philosophers, people who made observations about their natural world, but they had an approach that was based only on thinking, based on what they observed, based on what they knew. But it was really only thought out and supposed or reasoned with the logic that they had. It wasn't until Galileo and Newton came along that really what began experimental science. So designing an experiment, carrying the experiment out, and coming to a conclusion based on experimental evidence. So the additional component from what natural philosophers did and what Galileo and Newton began to do was that their understanding of the natural world became based on experimental evidence. However, a lot of the principles defined by natural philosophers are still known to be true today. Some of the basic things they observed were true, and we didn't need experimental evidence to tell us that they were true. But some of the laws and theories and models that we have now are going to be based on experimental evidence. And we're still making changes to some of those based on technology and our current understanding of our world. So what this brings about is called the scientific method. The scientific method is adaptable to the branch of science that you're using, whether it's physics, biology, chemistry, earth science, astronomy, biology. But the one thing that holds to be true is that they have the same general outline, the same goals, but the number of steps that you may see in the scientific method could be different based on the textbook you're using, the figure you're looking at, or the level of learning that you're applying it to. So the scientific method for an elementary school student is going to be very different from that of someone who's in graduate school. So the general outline is that we're going to pose a research question, make an observation about our natural world, about objects, and we're going to wonder something about it. Why does, or how could, if I throw this apple, what will happen if I throw it up into the air? Now that's a question you may already know the answer to, right? It's going to come back down. But that's a research question. What will happen? You make a hypothesis. The hypothesis is going to be what we think will happen. You're going to derive an experiment, design it based on what you know, what you're predicting, to try to prove your hypothesis as true. You're going to carry out the experiment. You're going to draw results from that, come to some conclusion about whether or not your hypothesis was supported or not supported. If the hypothesis is supported, you usually go on to report your results at that point in a journal, some sort of communication medium. If the hypothesis is not supported, sometimes you'll still go ahead and report that as a non-result. So it doesn't explain what we observed. It's not the answer, but it tells us that it's not the answer, which sometimes in science, knowing that something is not the answer is still an answer. It means that we won't repeat it somewhere else and get the same conclusion. Now, when the hypothesis is not supported, generally you're going to go back up to the beginning and you're going to start over. You're either going to adjust your research question. Maybe instead of throwing apples up, maybe I'm going to compare how an apple and a piece of paper fall differently. I might adjust my hypothesis to be better geared towards my actual experiment. And sometimes you're going to make some changes to your experiment. Maybe you didn't spend enough time designing it, or you didn't take into account all of the problems that might occur. So any of the three are options. And this is one big cycle. It could continue on and on and on until you finally answer your question. So here's an example. So this gardener made an observation that the soil and the seeds grew really well. And the question they asked themselves was, what type of fertilizer works best? The gardener goes out and buys 3 types of fertilizer, A, B, and C. And the hypothesis is that plants grown with fertilizer A will grow the fastest. Then the seeds are planted in the soil, the fertilizer is applied, and the results are A, B, and C. And so we see here that in A, the plant is very tall, very green, very healthy. In B, while the plant is kind of tall, it's kind of a brownish green color, doesn't really suggest it's a very healthy plant. And then C, the plant is very green, but it's very small, which suggests that the fertilizer C may keep plants healthy, but doesn't help them grow very fast. And the question was, which one's going to grow fastest? So the conclusion here is that the hypothesis was proven correct, that fertilizer A will grow plants faster. So that's the kind of application of a scientific method at the elementary school level, comparing different types of fertilizer. So what is a hypothesis? A hypothesis is a tentative explanation for your observation. Sometimes you're going to hear that this is an educated guess, but you're never going to make, there's no such thing as an educated guess. The two words together just don't really match up. When you're guessing at something, it's not necessarily because you're educated about it. You're just guessing. That suggests it's a 50-50 shot, and I'm going to take my 50-50 shot, like flipping a coin. However, when we make a hypothesis, you're going to base that on understanding that comes from your background, your education, your research you're doing before you set up your project. So it's not going to be a guess. You are actually going to come up with a tentative explanation for the observation. Now, your hypothesis should always have these 5 things. It should always explain what will happen. When I change the oil in my car, my gas mileage should improve. That's a hypothesis. It's explaining what's going to happen. Be clear and understandable. It must be testable. With the oil, I can change the oil in my car, and either the mileage is going to get better or it's going to get worse, but that's testable. It's measurable because I can determine through my odometer and the number of gallons in my car. I think even now smart vehicles keep track of your average MPG. So it's measurable. We can get a number with a unit. And it must contain an independent and a dependent variable. And those are going to be defined as the thing that we're controlling and the thing we're measuring. Okay, so the thing we're measuring is going to be the number that will change over time because we have changed a variable before and after changing the oil in my car. An experiment is going to be a recreation of an event or an occurrence to test a hypothesis. So in this case, my experiment would be changing the oil in my car. Sometimes it's like this kid here, you're in the lab, you have chemicals, you're going to test it that way. Other times experiments could be examples like here, where the person is taking what looks like an EEG of someone's brain. So not all experiments are going to be done in a laboratory, but they're usually going to be done in a controlled environment. So in a controlled experiment, it's a specific type of an experiment where you're going to compare 2 situations where all factors are going to be held the same except for one. So the reason why we're changing one variable is so that we understand how that one variable influences the results of our experiment. We're going to have 2 groups, the control group, which is the fixed group set for comparison, and then we're going to have the experimental group, the one that's going to have the factor that's going to be different, and that's the influencing factor. So for example, in this image right here, we have 2 different types of pots on the left, identical pots, identical soil, planting 10 beans per pot, so we're holding all of that constant. The only difference, and it's kind of hard to see initially, is that this says plus water and that says minus water. So essentially we're going to water one plant and not water the other and see what happens. Now you guys may be saying, well, obviously plants need water. The plants with no water are not going to grow. But this is something that we can't just take for granted. We should go ahead and confirm that with an experiment. Let's make sure that these plants won't grow. Is water necessary for plants to grow? We know that it probably is because of what we see with our world when it rains a lot versus when we have droughts and everything, grasses and trees and plants die off. But here, this is where we're testing it. So the control group is the plant where we are going to not add water. Okay, this is the plant, or the pot, the soil, the beans. The experimental group is the one where we're adding the water. We're adding an extra factor, which makes it our experimental group. So we're going to take a break here. We're going to do an activity, and then you'll come back and finish up chapter 1 in the second part.